The year was 1945, and over the dark waters of the Philippine Sea, the night felt unnaturally still, too still for a region torn by war. Japanese garrisons scattered across remote island outposts stared into the sky with a lingering sense of unease. Their searchlights probed the clouds like trembling fingers, convinced that nothing but darkness moved above them. They believed their bombers ruled these night skies. They believed the Americans had nothing capable of striking unseen, unheard, and unchallenged in the blackness. But they were wrong. Far beyond their sight, a lone predator drifted silently through the upper layers of night, a Northrop P-61 Black Widow, the Allies' first purpose-built night fighter. Its twin engines purred at a haunting low throttle, barely audible over the wind. Its radar dish pulsed like a heartbeat. Its crew, two young men hardened by months of nocturnal hunting, searched for shadows that didn't belong. On the islands below, Japanese crews were preparing for another routine night bombing run. Mechanics tightened bolts, loaded bombs, and wiped grease from their hands. Pilots climbed into their cockpits, surrounded by dim lantern light and the faint smell of fuel. Their officers assured them, once again, that the American night fighter was nothing but a rumor, an invention, a myth whispered by frightened troops. Yet above them, invisible in the cloud-soaked darkness, the myth was already locking onto its first target. As the Japanese engines roared to life, the Black Widow glided closer, unseen, patient, and hungry for a kill. The first moment came quietly enough that the Japanese bomber crew never sensed the danger coiling behind them like a shadow with a heartbeat. The night was thick, warm, and strangely calm as their aircraft rumbled down the narrow island runway. Tropical humidity clung to their uniforms, beating on their foreheads as the engines roared louder, vibrating through their bones. Lanterns flickered in the distance, casting trembling shapes across the ground crews who waved them onward. Dust swirled beneath the bomber's wheels, the smell of hot oil and exhaust swirling upward into the salted air. It felt like any other night operation. Routine, expected, unchallenged. The pilots had flown these routes countless times, confident the Americans had nothing capable of reaching them in the dark. Their commanders repeated that belief every night. No enemy aircraft could stalk them after sunset. No radar-equipped machine could hunt in total darkness. No American ghost lurked in the skies. And so they lifted off with absolute certainty. The bomber's heavy frame pulled free of the runway, its tires leaving the earth with a gentle bounce. The aircraft climbed steadily, its engines humming with the steady, dependable rhythm that bomber crews trusted like a heartbeat. The Japanese pilot adjusted his throttle, feeling the slight resistance in the lever, and settled the plane into a smooth ascent. The world below shrank into shadows, thin lines of palm trees, the glint of water, patches of moonlit clearing. Inside the cockpit, the crew were relaxed, focused but not tense. Their mission was long, but they had done this before. The navigator unfolded his charts, smoothing the creases with careful hands. The radio operator adjusted his dial, picking up occasional bursts of static. The gunner stared outward into a sea of darkness, absently tapping his finger on the metal rim of his turret. The air smelled of grease, sweat, and faint tobacco smoke left over from the last break before takeoff. Nothing appeared unusual. Nothing suggested death was drifting toward them like a whisper on the wind. But far behind them, so far that their eyes, their ears, and their instincts could not detect it, the Black Widow was already awake. In the cockpit of the P-61, the soft glow of radar illuminated the faces of its crew in pale green light. The radar operator leaned closer to his screen, adjusting the sensitivity, searching for the faintest pulse of reflected energy. The P-61's radar dish, hidden inside the aircraft's sleek nose, swept the night in silent arcs. Each sweep sent out an invisible wave. Each wave returned with secrets the darkness tried to hide. And suddenly, there it was, a small, slow-moving blip that had not been there moments earlier, a signal beating steadily against the bottom edge of the screen. It was unmistakable. The operator felt a chill run through him. Not fear, but the electric thrill of the hunt beginning. He tapped the screen lightly with a gloved finger, marking the target's position. "Contact," he murmured. "Dead ahead. Climbing." The pilot of the Black Widow lifted his eyes from the instruments and stared into the star-soaked darkness. He nudged the throttle, feeling the deep hum of the twin engines respond with smooth, predatory grace. The P-61 crept forward, its black, painted wings nearly invisible against the night sky. Its engines were throttled back, just enough to keep its noise swallowed by the wind. The aircraft moved as though it were not flying at all, but drifting, an apparition stitched into the clouds. The humidity fogged the edges of the canopy. Moisture beaded across the glass like trembling tears. The pilot wiped the inside with the edge of his glove, keeping his sightlines clear. The air felt heavy, warmer than usual, the kind of tropical thickness that made engines labor harder, and the scent of the ocean rise with intensity. Below, the Japanese bomber leveled out, gliding into smooth cruise altitude. The ocean stretched beneath them like a sheet of polished obsidian, broken only by faint reflections of moonlight trembling across the waves. Inside the bomber, the men settled into routine tasks, unaware that another set of eyes, cold, focused, and watching from a far higher vantage, had already marked them as prey. The navigator traced the coastline with a pencil. The radio operator leaned back, adjusting his headset. The pilot loosened his grip on the controls, feeling secure in their lonely stretch of sky. The gunner yawned, rubbing his eyes. The warmth of the night made him drowsy. He scanned lazily across the darkness, seeing nothing but endless black. If there was danger, it hid perfectly. Too perfectly. Up above, the P-61 inched closer, its engines whispering through the mist. The radar operator called out slight adjustments. Bearing left 2 degrees, closing distance, range shortening. Each phrase delivered with calm precision. The pilot made the slightest corrections, guiding the aircraft like a surgeon guiding a scalpel. The glow from the instruments reflected faintly on the canopy, but outside was nothing but void. The Black Widow sliced through subtle currents of warm air rising from the sea. Its propellers churned silently, disturbed only by the soft wavering of the wind. The men were silent now, speaking only when needed. This was their environment, their domain. They were hunters of darkness, born to strike at shadows that believed they were safe. Then the bomber appeared, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gently the way a distant shape emerges in fog. At first it was just a faint smudge against the stars. A slight disruption in the smooth curve of night. Then, as the P-61 drifted closer, the outline hardened. Wings stretched wide, its tail faintly illuminated by moonlight. A shimmering silver shape that belonged to another world, another mission, another belief that no enemy could possibly be watching. The Japanese bomber flew steadily, unaware of the predator matching its speed precisely. The faint flicker of its engine exhaust glowed orange for a moment, guiding the P-61 even more clearly. The Black Widow slid into position, just far enough behind and below that it would remain completely invisible to the bomber's rear gunner. The pilot steadied his breathing. His hands were calm. His heartbeat slow. He had done this before. But each hunt felt different, alive, personal, intimate. He could almost feel the presence of the men inside the bomber. Their conversations, their unaware movements, their belief that nothing haunted these skies. The night wrapped them like a blanket, comforting and deceptive. A deadly silence stretched between the two aircraft, broken only by the faint hiss of wind slipping past their metal skins. The pilot waited for the perfect moment. The bomber lumbered ahead, heavy and slow. Its engines coughed slightly during a minor adjustment in power. A small puff of exhaust flickered behind it. The P-61 eased closer. The radar operator whispered, 40 yards, 30-20. The numbers drifted through the cockpit like a countdown to inevitability. The pilot lifted his thumb toward the trigger. His eyes narrowed, studying the bomber's vulnerable underbelly. A simple squeeze would unleash the fury hidden within the Black Widow's guns. The bomber continued its flight, oblivious, trusting the darkness that had always protected it. Then came the burst. The P-61's cannons erupted with a harsh, ripping thunder that fractured the quiet night in an instant. 4 streams of bright tracer fire tore forward, glowing like molten spears hurled through the air. The rounds sliced into the bomber's fuselage with devastating speed, punching through metal, fuel tanks, and structural beams. The bomber jolted violently, its wings shuddering with the impact. A burst of flame bloomed from its side, small at first, then widening as oxygen fed the growing inferno. The gunner inside barely had time to scream. The navigator's hand froze above his chart. The pilot struggled with the controls, but the aircraft was dying faster than he could react. The smell of burning oil and exploding fuel filled the air as the bomber tipped sideways. Its right wing dipped sharply, catching fire along the edge. The flames illuminated the bomber with a ghastly orange glow, casting trembling shadows across the sea. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared in a final gasp as the aircraft spun downward. Inside, chaos erupted, shouting voices, frantic breaths, metal groaning under collapsing weight. But the night swallowed their cries before they could reach the ground. The bomber spiraled lower, trailing a desperate ribbon of smoke behind it. The fire grew brighter, reflecting off the waves below like liquid fire skimming across dark water. The P-61 banked gently to the left, pulling away from the falling wreck. For a moment, the bright fireball illuminated the underside of the Black Widow, revealing its sleek, predatory form. Wide wings, twin engines, black paint absorbing the light like a void-given shape. Then, as the flames flickered out behind it, the night consumed the aircraft again, leaving nothing but silence. The bomber hit the sea with a thunderous plume of steam and fire. Bits of flaming debris scattered across the surface before sinking into the depths, swallowed by the ocean within seconds. The explosion echoed faintly, a dim rumble fading into the distance. The sea returned to stillness. The sky returned to silence. And the Black Widow, predator of the dark, entered the clouds once more, vanishing as though it had never been there at all. Barely 20 minutes after the first bomber vanished into a column of fire on the black surface of the sea, the Japanese airbase was already shifting into a tense, uneasy rhythm. The ground crews had begun to notice something was wrong. The tower operators exchanged confused glances as they tried to make sense of a transmission cut off mid-sentence. A burst of static, a half-formed shout, a tone of fear they were not used to hearing from a bomber crew. They rechecked their equipment. They adjusted their dials. They listened again. Nothing. Only the familiar hum of electronics and the distant drone of aircraft engines warming up for the next sortie. It wasn't enough to trigger panic, but it was enough to unsettle the men. And on an island where superstition ran as deep as discipline, silence sometimes carried more weight than noise. Officers walked briskly between hangars, giving orders with forced confidence. They assured the mechanics and pilots that the missing transmission was a technical failure, just interference, nothing more. They had missions to complete. The Americans were pressing harder in the region, and the Imperial High Command demanded nightly attacks, regardless of weather, danger, or mystery. No delays were acceptable. And so, despite the subtle dread drifting across the runway like fog, the next flight group prepared for takeoff. Mechanics tightened bolts with practiced precision, wiping sweat from their hands as humid air clung to their skin. The metallic smell of fuel wafted through the warm breeze. Lanterns flickered along the edges of the runway, casting long shadows of men and machines stretching across the ground like silent omens. The new bomber crews gathered near their aircraft, some adjusting their harness straps, others murmuring quietly among themselves. They had heard rumors, whispers about an American night fighter, a shadow shape with glowing radar eyes, something that moved like a phantom, but the officers dismissed it as nonsense. Impossible, they repeated. If such an aircraft existed, we would know. The pilots nodded obediently, but in their eyes, uncertainty lingered. The night sky felt heavier now, thicker, as though the darkness itself was watching them. When the engines roared to life, the vibrations trembled through the metal frames of the bombers. The crews climbed inside, slamming their cockpit canopies shut, sealing themselves into the dim, green, lit interiors. The pilots checked their instruments, the navigators leaned over their charts, and the gunners adjusted their turrets. Everything looked normal. Everything sounded normal. But normal had already been broken without their knowledge. The first bomber lifted off the runway, then another, then the last. As they climbed into formation, their engines screamed against the humid night air. They banked eastward, following a familiar path, trusting the routine that had carried them through so many missions before. Below them, the island shrank into scattered points of faint light. The ocean stretched ahead, dark and infinite. The men felt the same mixture of boredom and alertness that always accompanied night flights. They checked their gauges. They listened to the drone of their engines. They stared into the black canvas around them, searching for anything out of place. They saw nothing. But above them, hidden high behind a veil of cloud, someone was watching. The P-61 Black Widow had drifted silently into a holding pattern. The radar operator sat hunched over his glowing screen, tapping a rhythm with his gloved finger as he made adjustments to the sensitivity. Then, without warning, 3 new blips appeared. 3 shapes close together, rising from the direction of the Japanese airfield. He leaned forward, squinting through the soft green haze. Multiple contacts, he whispered. The pilot turned slightly in his seat. Multiple targets meant multiple opportunities. He throttled up, and the Black Widow responded like a predator recognizing the scent of its next kill. The P-61 sliced through a bank of mist, its wingtips leaving faint trails of condensation. The engines rumbled with quiet menace, their power restrained, their noise swallowed by thick layers of cloud. The night air tasted salty and hot, Moisture clung to the canopy. Every movement felt heavier in the tropical night. But the Black Widow was built for this kind of hunting. The pilot and radar operator exchanged few words. They didn't need to speak. Years of training and months of night engagements had sculpted their coordination into instinct. Below, the Japanese formation flew straight and steady. Their pilots were focused on maintaining tight spacing, believing that unity would protect them. They were wrong. Flying close together only made them easier targets. Their engines roared with confidence, their exhaust flames flickering in synchronized rhythm. The navigator in the lead bomber traced their course lines with careful precision. The radio operator tried again to reach the base, attempting to confirm the status of the previous flight. Static answered him. High above the bombers, the P-61 circled once twice, narrowing its angle with each rotation. The radar operator fed constant updates. Closing, 60 seconds to visual descending now. The clouds thinned, revealing the faint silhouettes of 3 aircraft below. Their outlines shimmered in the moonlight, their metallic skin reflecting pale silver. The P-61 dropped lower, adjusting speed to match their pace. The bomber crews remained oblivious. They didn't hear the engines behind them, muted by distance and airflow. They didn't see the shadow merging with the night sky. They didn't feel the crosshairs settling silently onto their formation. The Black Widow struck first at the rear bomber. It began with a burst of cannon fire, bright streams of tracer rounds, carving downward like fiery creatures. The rounds tore through the bomber's tail section, igniting fuel lines and shredding metal. The explosion was instant. A rolling blossom of fire engulfed the aircraft, lighting the clouds from below with violent orange flashes. Pieces of the bomber broke apart midair, scattering flaming shards that illuminated the other 2 aircraft. The sudden burst of light felt like a flare of warning, but too late, far too late. Inside the surviving bombers, panic erupted. The gunners swung their turrets wildly, searching for an enemy they could not see. Their voices cracked through the radio with frantic shouts. "We are under attack! Something is behind us! We cannot see it!" The pilots swerved left then right, their hands trembling on the controls. Their movements were frantic, fearful, uncoordinated. The formation dissolved into chaos, but the P-61 pilot was already preparing his second strike. He banked right, swinging wide to line up a perfect attack angle. The engines howled as he increased throttle. He felt the G-force press against his chest. The surviving bombers were now flying erratically, their panic making them easy prey. The radar operator calmly updated the range. 40 yards, closing 20 steady. His voice steady despite the chaos unfolding below. The second bomber tried to dive, hoping to evade the unseen attacker. Its pilot shouted orders, his voice shaking. The nose pitched downward, the aircraft cutting through the humid air with desperate speed. But the P-61 dove with it, matching the fall effortlessly, a shadow glued to its tail. The bomber's wings rattled violently in the dive. A thin trail of smoke leaked from a damaged exhaust port. The crew's breathing grew rapid, frantic, their fear swallowing their discipline. The Black Widow fired again. The burst of cannon fire ripped through the bomber's fuselage, punching fiery holes along its spine. Flames burst outward, engulfing the cockpit windows. The aircraft lurched sideways, its right wing tearing away in a spray of burning metal. The bomber tumbled through the sky, shedding fragments that glowed like molten stars. It fell apart before it hit the sea, dissolving into a storm of debris that rained down into the dark water. The final bomber tried escaping by climbing, its engines roaring as the pilot shoved the throttle forward. He hoped altitude would save them. He hoped climbing into the clouds would offer safety. But the clouds only hid the P-61 for a moment before it emerged directly behind the climbing bomber, its cannons ready, its engines purring like a satisfied predator. The bomber crew screamed warnings through the radio, their voices breaking with fear. The gunner fired blind bursts into the darkness, trying desperately to hit something, anything. But the night betrayed him. His tracers vanished into nothing. The P-61 closed in. Its dark silhouette merged with the surrounding night, invisible except for the faint, ghostly reflection of moonlight on its wings. The pilot centered his aim and squeezed the trigger. Another line of blazing tracers cut through the sky, slicing into the bomber's left engine. The engine exploded with a violent flash, sending fire surging across the wing. The bomber banked sharply, trailing a massive arc of flame as it spiraled downward. The crew's terrified voices crackled over the radio, then faded as the aircraft's burning remains disappeared into a cloud layer below. On the ground, Japanese radio operators listened helplessly as static overwhelmed the final, broken transmissions of their bomber group. Officers shouted for clarity, demanding explanations, insisting no single enemy aircraft could do this. But the truth hung in the air like smoke drifting from a distant fire. Far above, the Black Widow leveled out, completely unscathed. And somewhere between the clouds and the sea, 3 bomber crews had vanished into the night. One more piece of evidence that an invisible hunter ruled the darkness. By the 70-minute mark, the Japanese airbase was caught in a grip of chaos unlike anything the men had ever experienced. Officers shouted orders with trembling authority, their voices cutting through the humid night air, but failing to bring order to the panic that had begun to seep into every corner of the base. Mechanics froze mid-step, grease, stained hands still gripping wrenches, as they craned their necks upward toward the sky, watching distant bursts of light that no one had expected to see. The radio operators gripped their headsets tightly, attempting once again to make contact with pilots who were either lost or burning somewhere above the dark ocean. Static answered them, only static. The usual routine of night operations had dissolved into confusion and fear. Whispers spread quickly among the men on the ground, rising over the hum of running engines. Impossible, some muttered. There is no such thing. Yet each explosion in the distance confirmed what they did not want to believe, and the word, myth, was replaced with a new, bitter truth. One American night fighter, invisible, silent, unstoppable, had claimed the sky. The next bomber group, waiting anxiously for takeoff, now hesitated. The pilots adjusted their straps, tested their controls, and scanned the sky nervously, exchanging glances with fellow crew members that said what no man dared to speak aloud, that tonight, the darkness was not their friend. The officers barked commands, insisting the sortie proceed, insisting that the enemy was nothing more than rumor, nothing more than an overactive imagination fed by tired nerves and superstition. But as engines roared and the heavy silhouettes lifted into the humid night, the tension on the island had grown to a tangible weight. Every man below the clouds could feel it pressing on his chest, a suffocating reminder that control was slipping through their fingers. Lantern light flickered along the tarmac, casting long, trembling shadows that seemed to dance like the ghosts of the aircraft already lost. Smoke from engine exhaust mingled with the thick tropical humidity, creating a haze that blurred reality, the horizon, and the danger lurking above. High above the formation, the P-61 Black Widow drifted like a wraith, black paint absorbing the faint glimmers of moonlight. Its twin engines purred at low throttle, a perfect mimic of the night's natural soundscape. The radar operator's eyes were glued to the glowing green sweep, tracing 3 new blips steadily moving together, climbing and maneuvering with careful precision, unaware of the silent predator now shadowing their every movement. The pilot made subtle adjustments, nudging the aircraft left, right, up, and down, matching their speed with uncanny accuracy. There was no panic inside the Black Widow's cockpit, only the cool, collected precision of men trained to hunt in the dead of night. They were hunters of shadows, of sound, of movement invisible to all but their instruments. Each blip on the radar represented not a mission, not a threat to be feared, but a target, vulnerable, unaware, and doomed. The first bomber erupted into flames almost before the crew below realized they were being watched. The tracer rounds ripped through fuselage and wing alike, leaving a streak of fiery orange that briefly illuminated the clouds and ocean below. The surviving 2 bombers faltered under the weight of fear and chaos. Their pilots attempted desperate maneuvers, diving toward the sea to break radar lock, banking sharply to evade an unseen attacker. But nothing worked. The Black Widow anticipated every move, every evasive action, every panicked reaction. With uncanny precision it followed, waiting for the perfect angle. The first of the 2 attempted to climb higher, seeking to escape through denser cloud cover, hoping for invisibility. Its crew shouted warnings and instructions over the radio, voices tight with panic. Enemy behind us! Enemy behind us! The gunners swung their turrets wildly, firing into darkness that held no tangible form. Tracer rounds vanished harmlessly into the night, and the Black Widow slipped past each desperate attempt with the ease of a phantom. A precise burst from its 20 mm cannons tore through an engine, flames erupting along the wing. The bomber shuddered violently, twisting in a spiral of destruction. Debris fell away into the night, scattering like molten stars before the aircraft ultimately disintegrated in midair. Smoke and fire lit the clouds in flickering orange and red, painting the sky with chaos while the P-61 banked away, silent, invisible, untouchable. The last bomber tried every possible evasive tactic, climbing, diving, rolling, attempting to use the moonlight and the clouds as camouflage. The crew's fear had stripped them of calm judgment, leaving only reflexive movements and frantic screams. Orders shouted in the cockpit were drowned by the roar of the engines, the hum of wind over metal, and the distant crackle of tracer fire. The navigator's hand trembled over the chart, trying to chart a course away from the unseen predator. The gunner's eyes widened, sweat stinging in the dim glow of his turret lights as he fired round after round, each futile, each disappearing into the darkness without so much as a spark of impact. But the Black Widow matched every movement, keeping the bomber in its sights with surgical precision. The pilot adjusted the aircraft, aligning the P-61's nose with lethal intent, the cannons already prepped, ready for the final strike. The moment was quiet, tense, electric, a suspended second between life and death. And then came the roar of the cannons once more, slicing through the air with a sound that seemed almost muffled against the ocean below, but precise enough to tear through the bomber's structure. Flames erupted from the left engine, consuming the wing in an instant. Metal screamed under stress. The crew's cries were swallowed by the night as the bomber spiraled helplessly downward, disintegrating in a violent bloom of fire that reflected across the ocean waves below. Below, the survivors on the island watched in horrified silence. Their eyes, wide with disbelief, traced the arcs of distant explosions. The radio operators' hands shook as they held the headsets, waiting for messages that would never come. Officers shouted again, demanded reports, tried to reassure themselves, and the men around them that this could not be real. That one aircraft could not possibly do this. Yet there was no denying the evidence. The scorched trail across the clouds, the columns of smoke rising from the water, the flaming debris that drifted down toward the islands. Panic had replaced routine. Discipline had crumbled. Even the most stoic and confident officers could not ignore the proof of what the Americans had achieved in 80 minutes. 3 bomber groups sent into the night, and 3 never returned. The Black Widow, having completed its deadly hunt, turned back toward the distant base, gliding through the clouds with stealth and grace. Its black wings were almost invisible against the dark sky, a predator that left no trace of its presence behind, save for the destruction it had wrought. The night once again swallowed the aircraft, leaving the horizon empty, calm, and deceptively serene. Yet the island below knew differently. The men who had mocked rumors now whispered the truth among themselves. One aircraft had claimed an entire night's bombing run, erasing it from history in less than an hour and a half. The fear that had been confined to shadows in their imaginations now existed in cold, undeniable reality. The Black Widow had become more than a machine. It was a specter, a myth realized, a force of nature that had demonstrated the limits of human expectation in the theater of war. Dawn crept slowly across the horizon, the first pale light cutting through the lingering darkness and smoke. Ground crews emerged from hangars, still gripping tools they had not used, staring out over the empty runways. Debris from the lost bombers had begun to wash ashore along the coastline, charred fragments glinting in the morning light. Officers gathered in small groups, heads bowed, exchanging fearful glances and whispered admissions. Survivors from nearby airfields recounted fragmented reports of explosions in the clouds, aircraft vanishing in flame, the eerie precision of a hunter that no one could see. One man, young, pale, and trembling, simply stared at the horizon, whispering under his breath, "There is a hunter in the sky. We cannot escape it. We cannot even see it." The psychological impact of the night's events rippled outward, reaching every corner of the islands under Japanese control. Fear replaced confidence. Caution replaced recklessness. Tales of the single-night fighters spread quickly, muttered from soldier to soldier, shared in tense gatherings, passed along the airfields and forward positions like wildfire. Each retelling added weight to the legend, but no embellishment could exaggerate the truth. One P-61 had eradicated 4 bombers in 80 minutes, leaving no trace of its existence other than smoke, debris, and the stunned disbelief of every man who had witnessed, heard, or survived its attack. The Black Widow itself disappeared into the clouds, silent and unseen, leaving behind only evidence of its presence and the terror it had wrought. The men on the ground, the officers in the control towers, the surviving crews, they had no choice but to accept that their calculations, their assumptions, and their confidence had all been shattered. One aircraft, invisible in the dark, had proven that night belonged not to the bomber crews, but to those trained to hunt within it. And as the sun rose over the islands, painting the ocean in pale gold, The echoes of fire, smoke, and fear lingered, a memory that would haunt Japanese pilots and officers for the remainder of the war. By morning, the airfield was empty of returning aircraft. Not one bomber had completed its mission, not one had returned to report, not one had survived the night. Only the faintest traces of fire and scattered wreckage remained as proof of the Black Widow's work. The impact was both immediate and profound. The night's events had destroyed aircraft, morale, and confidence in equal measure. Commanders were left with no choice but to accept the impossible. One aircraft, just one, had dominated the sky, eliminating an entire squadron in less than 80 minutes. Whispers across the islands solidified into consensus. There was a hunter in the darkness, a force they could not confront, a threat that had redefined the night itself. From then on, every Japanese pilot, every crew member, every officer looked to the night skies with a new wariness. Every sortie became a calculated risk. Every flight through darkness carried the shadow of the Black Widow, the memory of fire erupting from the clouds, and the knowledge that the hunter waited silently above, unseen, unstoppable, and exacting.